Hello and welcome to this video and to May's book review and book wrap up and what I read in May. So originally I was doing the Royal Readathon, the Epic Eras Royal Readathon that was taking place in May, and I sort of did take part, but instead of really trying to focus on the prompts, I basically read books and then tried to fit the books I read to the prompts. So I'm not really going to include that in this video just because I don't feel like I did it justice this time around, despite the fact that I did try and fit my books to the prompts. It didn't work quite as well as I have done in the past. It is what it is. I've had a mixed reading month. There are 6 books to talk to you about today. One was the last pick from April's number generated TBR, which I'll start with, and then I've read 5 books in the month of May, which is alright going, and my page count seems to be increasing every month as an interesting stat to look at. But anyway, the first book, or the last book I read in April, but the first book I'm going to talk to you about, is A Vintage Friendship by Cathy Hopkins. Now this follows 4 friends who were friends in the 70s and said they were never going to be like split up, they were always going to be best friends. Then life happens and gets in the way and they drift apart, but 3 of them are still sort of talking. Events mean that they come together and are trying to rebuild that close friendship, and then there's a 4th friend that they haven't heard from for ages. They don't know what's happened to her and they are trying to look for her because one of the women, Sarah, works in television and she is doing sort of like a long lost friend show, and that's going to form one of the episodes, but they do genuinely want to find the friend as well. So this is based on 4 women in their sort of late 50s, early 60s. They've gone through a lot of events in their life, so there are some darker themes in this that you may find triggering, particularly loss of a partner. That one is quite prevalent in this. My fault, not the book's fault. I wasn't having a great week when I was reading it, so my reading experience was probably tarnished because of that, and that is not the book's fault. But I was having a real issue that week with the fact that I was reading a book that was centered around 4 female friends, and I go through stages where it really irritates me that women seem to have a group of female friends that they're friends with for ages, and that's probably just my own jealousy because I don't have that. Majority of my close friends are male. We won't go into my backstory, but there's reasons why I don't have friends from like primary school and stuff like that because I moved a lot, so that always irks me a bit, and this is such a central theme to this book that possibly I certainly shouldn't have read it at the time that I read it, but that was part of my issue with it. But there are things in this book that genuinely weren't great. So as I said, they're doing this show about long lost friends, and as part of that they're trying to make a book deal out of it with the rules of friendship, and that then sort of got in the way of the plot. But also the way that it was written. We're looking for their friend Mitch, but we as the reader get chapters from Mitch's perspective from way back when, so we know Mitch's story, and then we get repeated as the 3 other women are working out it and finding her and etc. So it just felt very repetitive and very samey and a bit one note, which was a bit disappointing. If you ever do want to read a book by Cathy Hopkins, I can highly recommend the Kicking the Bucket List. It's a much better book in my opinion. Although I did enjoy Jo, who was one of the friends, she had a real zest for life. Most of this book wasn't really for me, and as I said, it was a bit samey, one note, and there were several things that kind of irritated me about it. So although on the whole kind of enjoyable, I think I gave this 3 stars. Not the best end to that April reading month. So that was A Vintage Friendship by Cathy Hopkins. We then come into May, and I decided to pick up this book because of that Royal Readathon, and one of the prompts was about a family dispute, and I thought, oh perfect, I'll get this chunky boy off my TBR. So I did try and start the prompts and stuff. So the next book I read was Grown Ups by Marian Keyes, which, as you can see, is a chunky boy at over 600 pages. What are we at? 637 pages of family dispute, kind of. So this follows the Caseys. There's 3 Casey brothers. All of them are married to different kinds of women. We start the prologue at a dinner where lots of secrets get revealed, although we don't know what the secrets are, just that, and then we rewind back and work our way forward. By rewind back, it's only by about 6 months or so, and work our way forward so that we know what all of the consequences are to what's being shared at that dinner. My overall opinion of this is that it's too long and it's too heavy to hold as a hardback. And although I, you know, relatively enjoyed it, again it was about 3 stars for me, it felt kind of stale. It felt like Marian Keyes hasn't come out of the early 2000s in her plot points and the way that she tells a story and the kind of things that are written about in this book. So it just felt very stale and very dated. And I feel like now adult contemporary books have come on so far that the concepts are just far more interesting than they were. And it's thanks to people like Marian Keyes that that's the case. But she didn't really add anything with this book. So to give it its dues, it was paced well. It was a thick book, but it didn't take ages to read, but there was not really any intrigue to it. There was no sort of like wow moment to it. Probably not gonna pick up any more Marian Keyes unless I get them very, very cheap due to this, but I am glad that I've got this chunky hardback off my TBR. If I ever get round to rereading any of these books, I might start with the Marian Keyes because they are all quite chunky, and it might be time for them to go. But I'm not sure that she's an author I'm going to particularly stick with anymore, despite having enjoyed some of her books in the past. But for now, that was Grown Ups by Marian Keyes. If you've been following my book videos throughout the year, you'll know I'm taking part in Buzzwordathon. The prompt this month was a book with like a flavour in the title, and I feel like I hit that one very, very well this month because I read Sweet Pea by J Skuse. This was also going to be I think it was Pinocchio, where to read a thriller or a horror, but it turned out that this wasn't quite that kind of concept, so that's where the sort of Royal Readathon stuff fell apart slightly, as this is more of a dark comedy, I would say. So in this we're following Rhiannon, who she essentially makes a kill list of pretty mundane stuff that she is disliking and then would like to kill the people because of that, but she then takes it further and actually commits the crime, and it's sort of how she gets away with it. It's her general life, it's her sort of psyche, and I thoroughly enjoyed this book. I gave this 4 stars. There was a lot of references to weight and calorie counting and that kind of stuff, and I didn't really feel that was in keeping with Rhiannon's character. That was my feeling on it, and that kind of irritated me a bit, and it came up a lot. I'm not really that bothered by sort of weight stuff in books, but certainly for both of these, it didn't really feel particularly necessary, and it didn't do anything for the story. And in 2023, do we really need that as a plot point? I don't know. But saying that, I did really enjoy it. It's sort of written in kind of diary format, which I enjoyed. You're in Rhiannon's head for the whole time, and although she is not a nice person, you actually quite sympathise with her and come to like her, and it's always a bit worrying when she's writing her kill list and you agree with the people that she puts on there. That probably says more about me than anything else. But despite all of her horrible acts, she's a likeable character. The only thing that I would say is that I didn't realise this was part of a series, and the ending very much ends on a cliffhanger, so I need to get the sequel now, which I don't like in a book. I do feel like they should wrap it up to a certain extent, so that you're not forced to buy sequels if you want to know what happens. But I understand, you know, book buying power and all of that, that a cliffhanger will be the way to go. But yeah, not for the faint-hearted, but if you can cope with the some of the dark themes in it, some of the graphic descriptions of murder, then definitely one worth reading, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. And that was Sweet Pea by J Skuse. The third book I read in May was Another Life by Jodie Chapman. This was to fit a prompt of read a underrated book, or a book that nobody had heard of, or whatever it was. So I thought, perfect, I'll read this one because I've never heard of it. I got this for Christmas. I think this was from Father Christmas, because he wanted to find a book that I hadn't read and hadn't heard of, and succeeded with this one. And I was quite excited because on the front it's got a tagline that says, "This is not a love story. This is a story about love," which is the opening, or near enough the opening, to my favourite film, which is 500 Days of Summer. So I thought, perfect, I'm gonna love this book. Unfortunately I didn't. This was the worst book I read this month, and one of the worst books I've read this year, although nothing's gonna beat Deathloop, I don't think. That was January, if you're interested. This follows Nick and Anna. They meet one summer when they're working in a cinema. They have like a whirlwind summer romance, and then because of Anna's religious beliefs, or Anna's family's religious beliefs, it means that they cannot stay together. But then later on in life they sort of reconnect and come together. There's a lot of situations in this that some people might find difficult to read about, so suicide, death of a parent, I think there's some other things, but I can't think of them at the moment. So yeah, it's not a happy book, shall we say. With this one, I know I said I didn't like it. It wasn't the story that I didn't like. It was actually quite a good story. As I said, it's very sad, and there is a lot of like heart to this book, and I do think there are people out there that would really enjoy it. It just wasn't for me, and that was more because of the writing style that I struggled with. How it's written is that the timeline jumps about, which is fine, I'm going to get on board with that, but I enjoyed more of the time when they were a teenager than when they were adults, and there was a point in the book where that stops. That's the point where they go their separate ways, and when that happened my enjoyment went meow, because I didn't particularly like either Anna or Nick. I wasn't that fussed about what happened to them, and I could see what the ending was going to be fairly sort of about halfway through, 2/3 through, and it was just a case of getting there rather than any excitement or anything that came out of the blue for me. Anna is part of a religious group, a bit like the Jehovah's Witnesses, but they're never named as that, and it was interesting to read about that kind of life, although it's not portrayed very positively within this book. So I'm not sure I got a very unbiased opinion of it in this, and the ending was a bit to tie it up in a bow. Although, you know, it did end and all the questions were answered, it just felt a bit too convenient compared to the lives that they've had throughout the rest of this. Lastly, there are a few bits of poetry in this. Didn't like it, didn't see the point of it, and it's compared to Sweet Sorrow by David Nichols. I would recommend reading that book instead. So it was a shame. I did have high hopes for this. I was hoping it was going to be a book that I really loved, but alas it wasn't, and that was Another Life by Jodie Chapman. Saying that though, I then read The Love Hypothesis by Hazelwood. This was for the prompt, let's say that, about a book with learning. They're based at a university, and I adored this book. This is the first 5-star I have given this year, and it was just so good. I had such a good time reading it. I just could not put this book down. I had about 100 pages left and I really struggled to get through work that day because I just wanted to read this book and see what happened to Olive and Adam. Although I knew what was going to happen to Olive and Adam because it's a romance book and they follow the same kind of pattern, but I just had to know. This is obviously a very hyped, very famous book. Unfortunately, there's this annoying permanent sticker that says it's a TikTok sensation. And for me personally, I agree with the hype for this book. So if you didn't know, this follows Olive and Adam. Olive is a PhD student at Stanford in the USA. The US schooling and college system confuses me, so that I don't really know what that means, but she's one of them. And her best friend and her sort of a guy that she went on a date with a couple of times are like perfect for each other, and they really like each other, but they won't get together because her best friend doesn't want to date her, let's call him her ex, because you know, friend code and girl code and all of that kind of stuff. So she really wants them to get together, and the only way she can think that her friend will do that is if she says and if she shows that she is dating someone else. So she randomly kisses a guy in the corridors of their university so that her friend will see, and then that guy turned out to be Professor Adam, who they made very clear that he doesn't teach her because that would be against the ethical code. So then they, for various reasons, start a string of fake dating. They pretend that they're in a relationship, and as we know with all of these books, a romance ensues. Fake dating is by far my favourite trope in a romance book. I think it's brilliant. I just love the sort of awkwardness and the different uncomfortable situations that they always get themselves into, and this book is exactly the same. There's an element of like grumpy sunshine in this because Adam is like surly and a grumpy professor and makes lots of people cry, but obviously throughout the book and with his time with Olive, the reader, we see different sides to him. A few other things that I really enjoyed were the STEM settings. So they are both scientists, biologists I think, and I think it's good to have that kind of representation, certainly of women in STEM, and the author herself is a woman in STEM, hence why she has put it into this setting. What I didn't realise before going into this was that this was actually like a fan fiction, or that's how it started out and how it's grown from there, which was interesting to me. And although they do use some scientific language in this book, which did go over my head, it really didn't detract from any of the story or anything like that. As I've said, I really liked Olive and Adam as characters. Olive, I could see elements of myself in her, so that always helps. And there is a bit of miscommunication in this book, which I normally hate, but I was so wrapped up in this story that I couldn't put it down, and I just didn't care. That's obviously a contradiction on my part because I normally dislike it and I normally pull a book down because of it, but meh to that one. The only things that I think that could have made this better is if we had alternating chapters. I would have loved to have heard Adam's point of view throughout it in different situations, and I could have had a bit more from the ending. If you haven't read this and you're interested at all, I highly recommend it. And as I said, for someone that doesn't give very many 5 stars, like I think for the last 2 years I've given 2 each year, for me to give this 5 stars, it's got to show that it's a good book. So there we go, that was The Love Hypothesis by Ali Hazelwood. And the last book that I read in the month of May was The Trouble with Perfect by Helena Duggan. We just completely threw out the Royal Readathon at this point. I just knew I wanted to read the second book this month, and I'm going to read the third book and the final book in this trilogy in June. So that's to come for you. So as I said, this is the sequel to A Place Called Perfect, which I read in April. We are still following Boy and Violet as what used to be called Perfect Town is now what it's called, is coming or is getting used to their new way of living, so I won't spoil the first book. But strange things start happening, things go missing, children are kidnapped, and an adventure unfurls from there. I'm not going to say too much more because I don't want to give any spoilers to it, to either the first book or this book, but I would say make sure you don't read the back of the third book before reading this one because it spoils it. And I accidentally did it because I took it out of my bookshelf thinking I picked up the second one, read the back and went, that's the wrong book, isn't it? So the big plot, I knew it because I accidentally read the book, the back of the third book. So don't do that. Don't learn from my mistakes. That probably didn't help my enjoyment of this book. It's very, like, the writing and the way things are described and how we go through it is very similar to the first, so I enjoyed that, and all the sort of slight dystopian-esque of the environment that we're in, because it's very much like normal life, but then you have things like the eye plants, which is fun. There were moments in this where I did feel a bit tense, but not enough that it had much of an impact on me, unlike this one where I just could not put it down. I could read my sections of this and then leave it be and not think about it. But I would say it's a very quick read. I've got through both these books, the first and the second one, in a matter of hours if we put it together. If we're doing it in my reading way, I tend to read before I go to bed, so I read it in 4 days because I just read for an hour and a half or so before bed. So they're very quick to get through, they're very easy reads, they are enjoyable. I would have liked, we need more Jack and Anna in these books. I hope the third one they get to make a good appearance because they are like the voice of reason and they're fun. What does frustrate me in these is how long it seems to take the characters to actually get to the point and actually understand what's going on as the reader, and maybe it's because I'm not the target audience. This is a middle grade book, so I'm considerably older than the target audience, maybe that's why, but I feel like they're being really dense, and they should be able to get to the answer quicker than they do. And lastly, the ending of this felt really, really rushed, and we have like a really big event that happens at the end of this which was sort of brushed over, and I feel more should have been made of it. But then, as I said, this is the second book, we do have a third that I'm about to start, so maybe it gets picked up more in that one. But yeah, definitely the ending needed to be a bit more. Hard to give a book review without telling you exactly what's happened and why I think it, but there we go. So a pretty strong end to the reading month, and I'm looking forward to June and what that holds. I'm not a fan of the buzzword thumb prompt, but we'll get into that next month when I let you know what I read in June. I don't know why I'm still holding this. That was The Trouble with Perfect by Helena Duggan, and that's the end of the video. So if you've enjoyed this one, please give it a thumbs up. If you haven't already, please go ahead and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!